I had students when I was doing my work in the Baltic states. Some would travel 24 hours from Siberia to do a weekend with me, and then 24 hours to go home back to work after the weekend. Two guys coming down to Latvia from Estonia had to cross the border without a visa, and so they drove the car to the border and walked around the border guards through the forest, and the snow was up to their chests as they were walking, and they picked up the car on the other side, driven through by a friend of theirs.
Wow.
Here I am offering it to you, sitting warmly in your New York City lounge there. Yeah, all right, James, I suppose it's all right. Go on then.
Yeah, that. Yeah.
I worked out long ago that the journey to get the teacher is more important than the teacher. And I haven't come across many people in the West now. In Russia, and like I've just described, it's totally normal for those people to expect an arduous journey to go and see a teacher. You know, it's just normal because everything else is arduous. But in the West, they miss out on the most important thing. And the most important thing is that you have to actually make a commitment to do something, to make it precious. You have to overcome hardship in order to access the teachings. And this is intuitively obvious to some people and absolutely bizarre to everyone else. So to me, it was really obvious that all I would need to do is to somehow get to a Sufi teacher, a real one, just get there, and nothing else was necessary from me, and that would be the deal. And I was on my way in Turkey to find Sufism, and I met this guy who had no interest in spiritual practices at all, and he said, "Oh, I know a Sufi. He lives up in the hills there." And I said, "Could you take me to him?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." And so we went up there, and this guy wasn't really a Sufi, to be honest. He was like he was like a dervish. He was studying Sufism, which is what you call a dervish, and yet he was very wise. And I just sat there and listened, and I listened so well that he just flooded me with everything I wanted. You know, and I was just like bathing in this feeling of being in the presence of somebody who knows. And the guy who introduced us, after about, I don't know, 45 minutes or something, interrupted this Sufi guy and was like, "How dare you?" And he said, "Go on, James, speak up, ask him some questions." Oh, I said, "You fucking idiot." Internally, you know, you have no idea what's going on here. You've just interrupted a great teacher, you know. But you weren't quite at that level that I was hoping for. And the journey I eventually took to find the man I needed to find was indeed very arduous indeed. So was that an anecdote or was that a teaching?
Teaching. Yeah.
Did you notice I started teaching? Yeah. This is a part of the game, as it were. There's a kind of game played where you have to create a filter. And people that can see the filter are the ones that can get through it. And the ones that can't see the filter, they just don't know that there's a filter and they bounce off. You know, oh God, if James is going to go on about that again, I got better things to do, you know. Absolutely, off you go. Go and find them. It's necessary just to put that filter in place for two reasons. First of all, the people that get through the filter can then resonate with each other on that higher level. And that is the wisdom. The teaching formula is rather like a battery. You need a positive and a negative polarity for the teaching electricity to flow. So the teacher is the positive pole, he's the yang, or she's the yang force. But the yin force, the negative polarity, is the group. And they have to be pretty much evenly matched. So right now I'm holding this group size, rather a small group size. And so this is, the teaching can kind of balance what your collective appetite is, which is a function of your current spiritual level and your number and your willingness to surrender the ego, a function of all those things. That creates a force field, a magnetism. And I feel that, and I enter that electrically. That's the positive, the electricity, and the magnetism is that which draws that from me, which I can't do alone. If I was trying to talk now into a camera, making one of my videos, I couldn't do it. Not at this level. Because your attention, can you feel now your attention has shifted in the last 2 minutes? I've just said something that's fascinating. And like, your attention is like, it's like very much richer. Can you feel that or not?
Yes.
I'll concentrate on that. I'm not telling you what I'm doing, but what I'm doing, I'll identify it when it's happening afterwards, just to see if you're getting it. There's a lot more to this than you've ever imagined. I can assure you of that. If we examine Sufi practice, we are not teaching Sufism. We're teaching the external form which Sufis use in order to actually manage energetic balancing and flow. What I've just been doing has been talking. I've just been talking. And actually, there's a transformation occurring in the energetic field, isn't there? That's the Sufi. That's what the Sufi stuff does. It just moves energy and can identify it and shape it and create a movement. Now, if you actually want to do that, shall we say, effectively, efficiently, without a huge amount of input from the teacher, then these practices have been evolved over literally thousands of years that seem to work. So we learn the practices because that's the language through which communication is made easy, but it's not necessary. I've seen people, and occasionally even I've done it myself, who can shift the energetic condition of a very large group of people with nothing more than a single note of a musical instrument. I can do that. Sometimes if like I'm really there red hot with it, and I don't think I've been like that for many a year, I could actually do that with my breath. I could shift the group. The Sufi practices themselves take 4 forms. One would be called wisdom or consciousness, when we just explain how it all works, the meaning of life, how it all hangs together, using words that can be checked out with the intellect. And such things as we don't die, we are eternal beings, I am a soul using this particular personality and body for the time being. Concepts like that are very helpful for us to focus on decisions and thoughts and so on. So there's a certain amount of philosophy within Sufism, but very, very little indeed. Most of the Sufi teachings is allegorical. the allegory of Nasruddin stories, for example, which look like children's fairy tales, you know, that kind of humor. They're deep teaching stories hidden within them. The poetry of Rumi can be understood on 7 different levels. Music itself, you can transport people rather easily using music if you can play with Sufi consciousness. And there are various methods, not many of which are intellectual, to be honest. They don't really have scripture. There's no dogma. There's no belief. And I doubt very much whether any 2 Sufi groups do the same thing, you know, let alone 2 Sufis, you know. So it's like very difficult to package as a very definite statement. But we can say that there are 4 types of practice. The first being, as I've said, wisdom teachings. The second would be breath. And this is something known for thousands of years, and many of the ancient breathing practices are included within the Sufi teachings. A lot of pranayama. There are any number of pranayama exercises. You might be familiar with the alternate nostril breathing practice. You know, there's the version where you breathe in, hold the breath, and breathe out, breathe in, hold the breath, and breathe out, and you balance the 2 sides, and you visualize the 2 spirals going up and down. That's called the Kundalini Kasab. There's a practice called Shugul, which is the origin of the 3 wise monkeys. You know, the monkeys that hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil. This is actually a breathing practice. Don't ever do that. It knocks your head out. On retreat, you can do it under guidance, but don't try to do it alone. And I did it very, very quickly, but there's been a recording, so yeah, don't do that. But you cover all of the holes in your head, and you get into a certain elevated state with certain visualizations and so on. So these breathing practices are very often linked with the other 2 practices, one of which is light, which normally takes the form of visualization. So you internally visualize shifting energies, and by doing so, you awaken different minor chakras that are not present within Hinduism. For example, there's one which we do know about, but there's 4 others that surround it. The sort of spiritual heart is one of those 4. So the Sufis have got a different idea about the energetic vortices. And also they focus on something around here between the heart chakra and the throat chakra called the wheel of fire. And that represents your creativity. So if you actually got some unexplained blockage here, it's very likely corresponds to a blockage in your creativity. If you have a blockage here, it's probable that you can't express what you feel for people. Well, you can't feel it if you've got a blockage there, and you can't express it if you've got a blockage here. So these chakra points tie up with psychological states and so on. There is also a sense of using light on the external level. So we actually go through trainings of looking at the sun, trying to sort of train ourselves to look at the sun, and you've got to you know limit what light you allow from the sun into your eyes to avoid blinding yourself. And you can cleanse your chakras as well at dawn when the sun's rays are not penetrating. But the first time I went to a Sufi retreat in London with the guy who did most of the teaching, he got us all to face the sun with the crown, and then face the sun with the third eye, and then face the sun with the throat chakra. And I thought, where's this going? And eventually it got to the base chakra, and he had all these middle-aged ladies looking their knickers down and facing the sun with their bottoms. I thought this guy has to be a master, because they were all sort of middle class posh ladies. So I thought, yeah, this is great. And there are other practices you can do, visualization practices, protections. If you feel that you're under psychic attack, and I know that phrase sounds a bit silly and romantic and dressed up, but it does happen. If somebody means you harm, if they don't like you and they're gossiping about you, then you're under psychic attack. And if you know that that's going on, in the daytime you can deal with it in one way, but you want to make sure that you're guarding yourself at nighttime. If, for example, you're on retreat and you're sleeping in close quarters with people that you don't know, you don't trust, that's one example of when you would want to guard yourself. And that used to happen more often than you can imagine when we were on retreat. You visualize a pyramid of light before you go to sleep, and you go to sleep with that visualization in your mind. There was a time when I was actually offering healing to a lover I had, and we were sleeping, and she just, oh, you know, put your hand over my heart. Something's wrong. And I did it, and I supported my hand, and I just dozed off. And she said it was great because the healing energy was coming through for like an hour afterwards. So even though I was sleeping, actually, there was something going on. So that's a kind of a visualization energy of sorts, where you just imagine healing energy flowing through you. So that's breath I've spoken of, and light and wisdom. The fourth is sound. And most of the practices we do are based on that principle of sound. Two types of sound practices, wazifa and zikr. Wazifa represents qualities. So, for example, life, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, facing conflict, empowerment, you know, they're all various qualities. And you would do particular wazifas, very often given to you by your guide. And some would be to address problems. If you lack vitality, then you might want to do yahai to build up your vitality. That's life, divine life. And if you're looking to try and resolve a situation that's all confused and people aren't telling the truth, yeah, huck, you know, that'll sort them out, and you get told the truth then, and everybody else sees the truth. And so, you know, some wazifas are used to develop qualities that are lacking. Some are used to develop qualities that are present in you. So if you happen to be a very peaceful person, you might be offered Ya Salam, Allah, as a practice to make you bring out that potential for bringing your inherent qualities up to the next level. And sometimes you just practice something which seems like a good spiritual quality to have, you know, so different reasons for doing the wazifas. However, the most creative, brilliant mind that has ever been applied to presenting wazifas in the 20th century in the West, Pir Vilayat Khan, he was known for his wazifa teachings. And in his last talk before he died, he was about 87 or something, he said, I know I've been spending a lot of time talking about wazifas, but really you can forget about them. The only thing important is zikr. And everybody's going like, oh my God, all my notes, I've wasted all that time, you know. And that's a quality of Sufism, really, is as well. The Sufis will do anything to avoid being caught up. They're essentially freedom seeking. There are one or two exceptional people that are able to play the game of being a leader and not getting caught up in the ego risk of that. But most Sufis would never want to waste that amount of energy by being subject to adulation. It's totally misunderstood. If somebody's admiring you and saying nice things about you all of the time, it gets to be a tremendous burden. One of my commentators on my videos I don't know her, I've never met her, but she keeps on saying longer and longer and more and more and more impressive things in favor of my videos. And I had somebody talking against one of the videos once, and this woman stepped up and said, I don't think you should criticize James, and she's become my hero. You know, I really don't want it. It's in my way, you know. But some part of my destiny is giving me this temptation of feeling important by being a public teacher. But most Sufis wouldn't want that. And the zikr practice is that which removes you from your ego. It's a very passionate, intense practice that dissolves the ego. And we've done a little bit of zikr already. I have a very mild version, which I normally do for myself. Allahu, 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 and I think we've done that one. So that's my bread and butter zikr, because it's not, doesn't require much of me, but it's just a maintenance level zikr. But if I was actually wanting to break through, then there are more passionate zikrs I would do. La illallah, illallah. Again and again and again and again for at least an hour, and maybe even 10 hours in a day if you're on retreat. That's the classical zikr. That's what real Sufis do. And it's a very big deal indeed. When I was really ardent, when I was in my 30s and filled with that kind of testosterone that young men have, I was doing this zikr incredibly passionately every day for over a year, 15 months or something. And I was in pain at the end of it. My head was on fire, and I had pain in bits of my body that I didn't have. This bit of me was hurting, and like, well, I haven't got anything there to hurt. You know, it's really very strange. But I was clearing an old torment that I'd been carrying with me since birth, birth trauma, and I hadn't been able to clear it for all that time. And eventually I got rid of it through this intense, passionate practice. I don't suppose many people would want to do that, but that was what was necessary for me. But it's interesting with the sound practice, actually, you speak the wazifa or the zikr so that you've got the sound in your ear. And then when you've got it there, you go into silence with it. So you're not actually making sound, you're just remembering sound, really, or imagining sound. So it's a sound practice, but it's non-audible, you know. And that's the fikr of the practice. So I'm talking about the classical zikr now. The practice begins to prepare us to let all that is false go and to enter into the truth of the one. Circling, we let go of our life as we know it, and love it and hate it. La illallah. We can do it in gentleness, in gratitude for its attempts to help us. The false self does not have to be an enemy that we batter to death. La illallah. Let us attend these deaths within us with reverence and gratitude. It is important to hold ourselves with genuine respect, even as we loosen the attachment to these lesser truths. The false self is usually frantic with fear and the prospect of annihilation. Find within your deep self a place of love that can hold the dying process, that understands that ego has had its own truth and very real struggles, and that it is not your enemy. Call upon God or Goddess to support this process. So at the level that I was in my 30s. La illallah, illallah. That was subject to a great deal of amusement when other people saw me doing it on Sufi retreats and so on. And they were doing, you know, la illallah, illallah. Very gentle and middle class kind of zikr. But the teacher, he was doing one goes a long way. It's very difficult to do lots of those, but my teacher was able to. Bowing, we surrender everything to the one. We bow to the heart, and our own heart opens to the divine heart. God receives us. We die in the divine presence. Each time we bow, the dying of all things false becomes greater and greater. Our capacity and willingness to surrender deepens. Each time we bow, our heart grows and becomes more alive. We even bring our unwillingness to surrender and die. Not my will, but thy will. Rising, we are reborn through the divine heart. Each time we rise, we grow closer and closer to the one. Rising, our own heart begins to open and become an organ of divine knowing and divine love. Resting in the heart, we feel the one, the divine presence. The zikr is essentially a practice of remembrance. The remembering of the divine becomes more and more subtle. In the right time, everything is remembered. God shields us from the memory of him or her until we are ready. And I think this is a very important thing to understand, that were we to be able to see God without protection, we would be burned. It would be like a lightning bolt. It would not be survivable. And I've touched that feeling to some small extent on a meditation we used to do in Devon once, Fast Abbey. But there's a room there. It was renamed. I think it's called St. Michael Chapel now. When we were there, which was very interesting because St. Michael is the sponsor of my work. And I used to go each night. I used to live a walk away, and on Friday nights everybody else would turn up, and it was like 20 people, 25 people, all of whom moved to Buckfastleigh in order to meditate. You know, so these people knew how to meditate, and I was just really painful. You know, so powerful stuff. But nothing compared to my experience in the first time I did zikr in Turkey. I was the guest of honor. It so happened by synchronous processes that I arrived in this particular town just before the birthday celebration for Muhammad. And I was invited to join them with this zikr. I was quite special. They hadn't seen a Westerner before. This was one of the most piddling little towns in Turkey. You can't imagine how surprised they were to see me. And they put me in the center of this group of 60, 100 dervishes, all sitting on shelves in this rather small room. And this sheikh was leading the zikr to celebrate the birth of Muhammad. And I was in the middle. And it took me something like 15 minutes before I was really in pain. I mean, I was burning up with this spiritual, what's called chesbi, spiritual energy. And like, it was not pleasant or comfortable. And they had to lift me up. About 4 or 5 men lifted me up and put me in the corner, and they continued all night. I mean, I just, I stayed like that for about 5 or 6 hours, and then it was dawn, and they said, "Come on, James." So they sort of laid me down in some mosque somewhere, and yeah. So the real deal is really quite something. Now let me give you a sense of a more subtle practice, because the zikr practice is the king and queen of all practices, really. Well, I don't know. There's another one which I find equally profound, which is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and that just Kundalini practice. That kind of just reminds us that we're an agency through which the spirit and earth are connected. That's the purpose of our species. Our species is incarnated in order to bring light into the earth plane. And nature, you may have noticed, is cruel and kills everything and that it wants to eat. But we stand in between that, and if we actually find a way to live in harmony with nature, such as the Native Americans are said to have been able to do, where they regard killing the weakest deer in the forest as being an appropriate thing to do, and they pray as they celebrate the movement of that deer forward, and everybody's happy, including the injured deer. So there is a way to kill without violence, and this approach, sacredness is brought to everything you do. So that was what things might well have been like in a long time ago. Now, one of the things you can do with zikr is visualize different things as you do it. So you might find a very, very simple form of zikr. Allahu Allahu is the one I would choose, and I would say that, and I would hold a visualization as I said that, and whatever I was visualizing would become the energetic result of the practice. So typically you would choose qualities. So I might choose the quality. See, I familiarized myself with these words, and if I say Allahu Akbar, I have a whole string of events associated with that particular state. And there's a guy, one of my students, the very one that crossed the border from Estonia to come and see me, Volodya. He and I would do zikr in the same way. And one of the things they do in Turkey, they're kneeling, and the zikr is becoming more and more and more passionate. These are guys. There's no women in these circles in Turkey. They wouldn't do that. So these are men, and they're really getting into their fiery energy. And Volodya and I just did that. And I saw some guy do this in Turkey. He bounced across the circle so that he was face to face with someone and practiced the zikr really in close contact with another man. And I did that with Volodya, and we were very, very fiery, like incredibly fiery, but going really passionately and ignoring everyone else. Wow, yeah, that's what I came for. Really amazing feeling. And it just so happened next day, that one of the things we did before lunch was karma yoga. We would work in the forest, moving dead wood, burning it off, and cleaning the forest. That was what we did before lunch. But this fiery zikr was just so much. I was actually working alone, and I set the bloody forest on fire. I was just, I went too far, and the whole fucking forest was on fire. And these students came rushing up with like blankets and carpets and beating it out, and they put the fire out, and nobody said a word. It was a silent retreat, and they didn't speak. and I was so pleased, such discipline. So you have to be a bit careful with that element of the fiery sort of sense of it. I guess other dangers would exist. So Allahu Akbar, if you want to actually develop your fire, then that's a practice that you'd want to do, and you'd visualize that energy as you did the zikr, if you wanted to do that. If you want to raise yourself, if you're a bit dull or lifeless and you can't find anything in life to make you feel good, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, and you feel that kind of vitality. If you feel the need for purification and you'd like to be pristine in your spirituality, Subhanallah, Subhanallah. So you either use his practices or you'd center them as part of your zikr. But you could go for other qualities. You could visualize soil or vegetation for the earth quality, or a crystal, something. And if you visualized a crystal, you would become centered and cohesive. If you're a bit fluffy in your thinking and you couldn't get it together, you'd visualize a crystal. Maybe water, if you need maybe to influence children. I actually remember one of the practices is to visualize wine. And as you know, in Sufism, they don't drink wine, but you can visualize it. So I tried this practice. And it actually made me feel exactly the same way that I would have felt had I drunk, good quantity and a good quality of wine. It just felt like I had to have a bottle of wine. It was just brilliant, so cheap. You can visualize the sun. That would take a certain amount of courage and power. You don't want to mess with this stuff. I used to do all of this, and the Sufi teacher I met in Istanbul, he was so angry with me because I was doing these visualizations that were so high above my level. And he said, "Who taught you that?" I said, "Well, nobody taught me that. I just worked it out and made it up, and why not?" He said, "You're playing with fire, you're stupid, you boy." He used to talk down to me. He used to treat me like a dog. We didn't like each other. Very awkward. Because both of us had sun, moon in Taurus. He was a German and quite a proud man, bordering on arrogance. And, I am what I am. And so we kind of clashed. And I remember the moment I met him in this tiny little insignificant village in Turkey. And he was subject to this adulation from all the dervishes. They were all treating him like a saint, really, or an angel. And they didn't talk to me for about 3 hours, and they kept on forcing this horrible sweet tea on me. And another cup of tea. And I said, "Look, I can't drink another cup of tea." And it is so incredibly offensive in Turkey to refuse a gift, a hospitality gift. Mm. And I just really made these guys angry because I said, "Look, I'm not drinking it. I don't care what you want to do to me. I ain't drinking it. I don't take it out. I'm not having it." 3 hours of being ignored and forced to drink this horrible sweet tea. And Abdullah just said, "Just put the spoon on the top. That'll tell him." So I put the spoon on the top, and they all went, "Oh, okay." And then he started to talk to me, and he said, "Would you have any questions?" And I didn't know how many questions I was going to get, so I said to him, "Well, last night I was doing this practice, and could you tell me what it means, ya hay and ya hak?" And he just raised himself to an enormous, gigantic level. He looked down his nose at me and he said, "These are the holy names of God and may not be translated." And I said, "Listen, mister, I've traveled a very long way to come here to meet the Sufis. You're the first bloke that's actually spoken to me in 9 weeks, and I'm not going to be spoken to like that, ever, by anyone." And all the dervishes just like, "Oh my God." And they were waiting for me to be struck dead with lightning. It's never happened before in Turkey, let alone in their presence, you know. You just don't speak to a Sufi master like that, you know. Leaving me alone for 3 hours without talking to me and forcing me to drink this sweet tea. Who does that? Fuck you, you know. And it was so totally and utterly authentic. He said, "Oh yeah, you'll do. Come with me," and he just walked off. And I just picked up my backpack, which I kind of prepared for anything, and I just ran after him. Like I said, he treated me like a dog, and we got on a bus. He just come 16 hours by bus from Istanbul to spend one evening in this godforsaken little town in the middle of nowhere. And he got on another bus. He said, "Come on, let's go." And we went to Istanbul there and then, you know. 1 minute sitting in the cafe, next minute on a bus to Turkey, you know, to Istanbul. And Istanbul buses, I mean, any buses in Turkey, they're rather dangerous places. All the men, to support their machismo, they're carrying knives, you know, and nobody would be able to use one, but they all carried knives and they all smoke cigarettes and they all hate each other. And it's a terrible experience in the 80s to get on a Turkish bus. And he just helped somebody with their luggage, whistled a song, smiled at somebody, he helps an old lady sit down, and everybody on the bus was just like, "Oh yeah." And he just transformed the bus into a pleasant event, you know. And we had this lovely trip. It was like wow, now that is real mastery, you know. But he never came to like me. He gave me terrible examinations. But any questions?
Are Sufis vegetarians?
Abdullah wasn't. He was a pig. He used to eat horrible things, awful hearts, livers, and I couldn't stomach what he used to eat. I don't think you can say, "Are Sufis this?" and get any meaningful answer. They're not collectivized, really. They're highly individualized. The thing is that a lot of them are Muslim. Most of them are Muslims, so they really tend to be good Muslims. So they probably wouldn't drink alcohol. You know, I doubt if there are many Sufis that smoke dope and drink alcohol. You know, my strand of Sufism came through a man who we think of as a saint, Hazrat Inayat Khan. He was born in India and was a musician in the court. So he used to play the ney, which is a reed flute, which is central to traditional classical Sufism. You go by the riverside, you cut your reed and you shape it into a flute, and you play it and you bring it to life. And it's a very, very subtle and profound breathing exercise if you can do that. And very, very few people can actually get a note out of it. But when you can, it's divine. I mean, when you actually listen to Sufi music on YouTube or whatever, there are two types: the Jalal type and the Jamal type. The Jalal is masculine and is loud and full on, and the Jamal type is very often the ney. You know, that haunting flute music you very often get in Sufi music. That's the ney. So Inayat Khan was a player of the ney in the court of the Maharaja. And so he was like very, very upper class. And he came to America in 1923-ish, somewhere around there, and introduced Indian music. His brothers went with him and they used to play Indian music there. And the audience was so unpracticed that after like 15-20 minutes of tuning up their instruments, they'd stop and get ready to sort of begin the concert, and the audience would clap thinking that was the first piece. You know, they just didn't understand, and they couldn't treat him properly, and he was just treated like Americans treat people, which is not how he used to be treated. You know, he was such a very high man, and he was treated with the utmost respect in the Maharaja's company. He was a musician, you know, a court musician, almost like one above the Maharaja in a sense. So he came to America and was treated like a wog. Oh, you bloody wog, you know, you Indian colored person, you're just one up from a Negro. We're not even sure about that. And you can't play music. That's not jazz. That's not blues. That's not music. It's not gospel, you know. And so he put up with all of that. And he tried again and again in America. In Russia, they were very much happier with him. In France, he got a good reception. In England, not so much. In Holland, not, you know. So he tried in Europe and the West. But it broke him, and as a very young man, he died. He went back to India for a holiday, and he saw what had happened to his beloved India. The classic beauty of India was ruined in the time that he'd been away. It'd become industrialized and modernized, and he'd lost everything. And he'd just come back from this disgusting American kind of version of life, hoping to bask in the beauty of India, and it was gone forever, and he just died of the flu. But it was disappointment, really. But he did leave behind him this wonderful teaching. You know, he's an amazing teacher. You might have heard me say this prayer: Beloved Lord, Almighty God, through the rays of the sun, through the waves of the air, through the all-pervading life in space, purify and revivify me, and I pray heal my body, heart, and soul. That's an example of one of his prayers. A lot of the teachings of Hazrat Anand Khan kind of evolved when an attempt was made to introduce sacred dance and musicality, bring it up to date in the modern era. So you had a group of people in the 60s, particularly in California, who were genuinely wanting to open up their spiritual side. And there wasn't anything for them in the West. Christianity just didn't work. And so a lot of them took teachings from the East and packaged them differently. And there was a bit of a bounce where Eastern teachings came to California, repackaged, they sort of then went into Europe. And this happened to many, many different techniques. And certain countries were more receptive than others. Germany was very receptive, as it happens. England pretty much so. Russia very much so when the time came. So not every country got it. The Mediterranean countries generally didn't. It wasn't their way of dancing. But what I picked up on mostly was the dance. And we've developed a dance form using some of the Sufi material. And this became quite well practiced around the world. There's at least 100,000, probably double by now, people who do dances of universal peace, which was my thing. And so we've learned practices from different traditions than Islam, whereas the Islamic practices are in the Arabic tongue. And when we're working on the Fatiha, then that's very definitely an Islamic practice. But we also were taught within this field of dances of universal peace, such things as the Aramaic pronunciation of the Lord's Prayer, which I find even more beautiful than the Fatiha. It's wonderful, isn't it? Like, whoa. And the Beatitudes as well. You know, it's like we were dancing whilst we were singing these. It's like, yeah, heaven. So I've some other mantras in different languages. And we did study paganism as well. So all of this now really comes into modern day Western Sufism, the non-Islamic approach to Sufism, which has got 100 years of track record. You know, it's not that new now. It's introduced then. with Hazrat Ali Khan. And in fact, before then, there was Sufism in Europe, and Sufism's philosophy has been embraced by into European philosophy, because around the time of the Enlightenment, the Moors were kicked out of Spain in 1493-ish, and nevertheless, some of the Sufis stayed on in Spain, and a lot of the kind of ideas got centralized in the courts of Europe. So Sufism has actually had an effect upon the West for a long time, 500 years for sure, and recently another 100 years. So let me give you some teachings that I've picked up from Hazrat Naya Khan. The inner life. Spiritual path is a journey. The preparation for this journey is a belief in God, a guide, a disciplined mind and attitude, a worldly path, balance, resources, and a farewell to your past. Your object is the realization of God, to develop the presence, and duty as whatever parent in your family, in your work, a sense of service. It includes silence and a sense of natural pride, not self-importance, but pride in a job well done, a sense of realization. Hazrat Ali Khan just 100 years ago. A virtue carried too far may become a sin. At the end of the valley of sin, do not be surprised if you find virtue standing. Souls unite at the meeting of a glance. Success spoils people. Failure ruins them. Things are as you look at them. One who is never alone does not know the joy of being alone. A charming personality is great riches. A consent after refusing is worse than a refusal. A house is built with matter, but made with spirit. A real artist expresses his soul in his art. A sharp tongue can cut one deeper than a knife. A sharp tongue is a poisoned sword. Accomplishment is more valuable than what is accomplished.
James, I have a question. I'm very interested in the visualization that you were saying, and especially the elementals. So, for example, if I wanted to be more creative or let's say more fertile in my imagination, um, what is a Sufi practice that I can recite or something that I can do to do that? And I have like something like that, like if I want to be more practical, rooted, or grounded. So what is the earth like practice that I can do?
Okay, the protocol which we observe for a good reason is that the way in which you present yourself to a Sufi teacher is to just indicate your sense of lack or need and trust that the Sufi will respond appropriately. The idea that you can tell me what practices you want isn't really accepted within the normal Sufi teachings, because that which is guarding you from awakening is an ego that fears annihilation. If you're able to put aside your own ego rather than depend upon the Sufi teacher to do that for you, then you actually reveal that which is underneath the ego, the humble side of yourself, and that's much more vulnerable. And the vulnerability that you're feeling is what the Sufi then picks up on and addresses that. I used to do this with Abdullah when I first met him. I used to ask him very specific questions, very similar to you, because your Mercury and my Mercury are exactly the same place. And I'd say, what's the word for this? And he'd raise himself up in this arrogant way he had and look down upon me, and he'd say, I did not choose to deliver this teaching to you, my boy. You know, and there's a reason for it. I mean, he wasn't only trying to dominate me, although I think there was a bit of that in there. He was also trying to explain it just doesn't work. If you keep on asking for what you think you want, you'll keep on getting the wrong stuff. If you could ask the right question, then you wouldn't need a Sufi guide, because you'd be asking the right question. The teaching on this is a story. A Sufi comes across a guy who's just about to get into the water and swim to a distant island. And the Sufi said, and he had a whole ton of cabbages on his back. And the Sufi said to this guy, where are you going? He said, well, I'm going to swim to that island over there. There's land over there, and you know, I want to live over there. And he said, what are you doing with the cabbages on your back? And he said, well, I need some food when I arrive, you know, to keep me going. And he said, well, don't you realize that carrying a ton of cabbages on your back is going to make sure that you just don't arrive, you know, you're going to die. And he said, no, you don't understand. I need food when I arrive.
I remember Richard asked a question. What is my question? So is this the right question to ask Sufi master? What's my question?
Yeah, that's what I did to mine. I used to sit and I'd just say, how am I? You know, and I'd just listen. I'd never ask him any questions, just how am I? And I just allow him to read my bits and pieces. And he said, oh, you know, you need to focus on the back of your heart is a bit blocked, you know, and he used to tell me what I needed to do. And then I'd go away, and a year later I'd come back and ask him, you know, the same question. Do you understand what I've just said about the cabbages? The correct answer is no. Good, honest, well done. I know that you don't understand that. And the reason I know that is because when I actually say something, I can actually feel whether or not that thing has been understood. Now, I know how impossible that sounds, but that's the truth. And I can understand who actually gets me and who actually is not quite sure yet and who's waiting and doesn't make a judgment. I can feel all of that. I will tell you the answer to your question, the first part of it anyway. There are 3 practices that you can do to develop your creativity. Ya Khaliq, Ya Bari, and Ya Musawir. The first is the sculptor takes the rough shape of what he's going to sculpt and takes the block of granite, roughly speaking, the right side. That's the first job in creativity. You have to just define the scope of what you're making. And then the second process is to shape it into more or less the finished article. And it's exactly the way you want it to be, almost. And that's Ya Bari. The first is Ya Khaliq. Can you feel the sculptor chiseling the granite? Khaliq is like, you know, very onomatopoeic, isn't it? The second one, Bari, or kind of, you know, you're engaged with the creative process. But the final one is Ya Musawir. Very soft and gentle, and that's the finest sandpaper. You know, that's the final detail. That's very delicate. So you've got a range of energies there. The first one is hard and sharp and aggressive. And the last is soft and gentle and, you know, like silk. And the middle is just, you know, industrious and focused. You know, the 3 different elements of creativity there. If you don't get all 3 right, then you can't do what you need to do, and apply that to personality. Each of us is creating our personality, and a part of our personality is sharp, khalik. This is what I am. You know, I'm never going to be a kindergarten teacher. That's not my function in life. You know, I'm going to be this, more or less. And then I spend decades shaping that, and then finally polishing it in the last part of my life, so that eventually I get to be a nice person after all these years. The first part of what I was talking about today, do you remember I said I was taken to this Sufi teacher and I just kept my mouth shut for 45 minutes until this asshole started talking? Do you remember I sort of said that? Any ideas why I might have said that? It's the most difficult part of all of this, is actually to understand that the way we have been bullied and trained and shaped by propaganda in the West is impossible for us to understand. We just don't know the extent to which we have been shaped by the forces that want anything to prevent us from becoming realized beings. Every one of us is carrying a ton of cabbages, and we just can't recognize that we are. We can see each other's cabbages really, really clearly. We do everything we can to mention, oh, look, your cabbages, is that what you want? But like, you know, a good idea if you got rid of your own first. And that's actually the tricky part of Sufism. And there's all manner of ways you can do that. Humor and bullying and explaining and persuading and dancing. And, you know, that's why Sufism is so wide. And, you know, especially with my Sabian symbol being what it is. You know, I'm just trying to find more and more different ways of doing this thing.